The quiet panic. You guys have been absolutely flooding my comments asking for more gas station horror stories, and honestly, I get it. There's something uniquely terrifying about those fluorescent lit islands in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the hum of fuel pumps. It took me weeks to dig through hundreds of submissions, but I finally found 3 stories that will make you think twice about stopping for gas after midnight. Picture this. You're driving late at night, your fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty, and that familiar orange glow appears in the distance. Most of the time, it's just a routine stop. Fill up, grab a snack, maybe use the restroom, and you're back on the road. But for the people in tonight's stories, what should have been a simple pit stop turned into something far more sinister. Now, before we dive in, I need you to understand something. These aren't your typical urban legends or stories passed down through friends of friends. Every single account you're about to hear has been verified and comes directly from the people who lived through these experiences. I've spent countless hours fact-checking details, cross-referencing locations, and speaking with the individuals involved. What you're about to hear actually happened. The first story takes place on a desolate stretch of highway in rural Montana, where a college student's late-night drive home for spring break became a nightmare she'll never forget. The second involves a trucker who thought he'd seen everything during his 20 years on the road, until one stop at a seemingly normal gas station proved him dead wrong. And the third, well, let's just say it involves a night shift worker whose routine closing procedures were interrupted by something that still gives him panic attacks to this day. What makes gas stations so uniquely terrifying is their isolation. Think about it. They're often the only source of light for miles, beacons that attract both the desperate and the dangerous. The bright fluorescent lights create these harsh shadows that can hide anything lurking just beyond their reach. And once you step out of your car, you're completely exposed, vulnerable to whatever might be watching from the darkness. I want you to imagine yourself in each of these situations as I tell them. Picture the cold night air hitting your face as you step out to pump gas. Feel that uneasy sensation when you realize you're completely alone, with nothing but empty highway stretching in both directions. Hear the distant hum of the refrigeration units mixing with the sound of wind whistling through the canopy above. Now imagine that peaceful solitude being shattered by something that shouldn't be there. Our first story comes from Sarah, who was 19 at the time and driving back to her hometown after finishing her finals at the University of Montana. It was late March and spring break couldn't have come at a better time. She'd been pulling all-nighters for weeks, surviving on energy drinks and determination, and the thought of sleeping in her childhood bedroom felt like paradise. The drive from Missoula to her parents' house in Great Falls was one she'd made dozens of times, but never this late at night. It was just past midnight when she realized her gas tank was running dangerously low. The fuel light had been on for at least 20 miles and she was starting to panic about being stranded in the middle of nowhere with a dead phone battery. That's when she saw it. A lone gas station appearing like an oasis in the darkness. The sign was old and weathered, advertising a brand she didn't recognize. But the pumps looked functional, and the convenience store windows glowed with that familiar harsh white light. She pulled up to the pump closest to the building, relieved to finally have found salvation. The station was eerily quiet. No other cars, no sounds except for the constant buzz of the overhead lights and the distant hum of refrigeration units from inside the store. Sarah grabbed her debit card and approached the pump. But something felt off. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Even on empty highways, there's usually the sound of distant traffic or wind through trees, but here there was nothing. As she inserted her card and began pumping gas, she noticed the convenience store looked different than most. The windows were tinted darker than usual, making it impossible to see clearly inside despite the bright lights. She could make out the vague shapes of shelving and what looked like a person behind the counter, but everything seemed slightly distorted, like looking through water. The pump was taking forever to fill her tank, clicking along at an agonizingly slow pace. Sarah found herself glancing around nervously, that familiar feeling of being watched creeping up her spine. The shadows beyond the canopy seemed deeper than they should be, and she couldn't shake the sensation that something was moving just outside her peripheral vision. That's when she heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from somewhere behind her. At first, she thought it might be another customer, but when she turned around, the parking lot was still completely empty. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. She looked toward the store windows, but the tinted glass made it impossible to tell if someone inside was trying to get her attention. The fuel pump finally clicked off, but as Sarah reached to replace the nozzle, the tapping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound itself. She hurried to screw on her gas cap, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with the simple task. Every instinct was telling her to get back in her car and leave immediately. But then the lights inside the convenience store flickered. Not the usual brief flicker of old fluorescent bulbs, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, then 3 short flashes again. Sarah recognized it immediately from a childhood camping trip where her father had taught her basic Morse code. SOS, someone inside was signaling for help. She stood frozen beside her car, torn between her instinct to flee and the possibility that someone inside genuinely needed assistance. The lights flickered again, the same pattern, more urgently this time. Against every fiber of common sense screaming at her to leave, Sarah found herself walking toward the store entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a harsh mechanical wheeze, and she stepped into the harshly lit interior. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Not the usual combination of coffee, hot dogs, and cleaning supplies you'd expect, but something else entirely. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The store layout was wrong somehow. The aisles seemed too narrow, the shelving too high, creating a maze-like feeling that disoriented her immediately. She called out, asking if anyone needed help, but her voice seemed to be absorbed by the space, creating no echo despite the hard surfaces everywhere. That's when she saw him. The clerk behind the counter. At first glance, he appeared normal enough, but as Sarah approached, the details became increasingly disturbing. His uniform was pristine as if it had just been pressed, but his face was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. He was staring directly at her, but his eyes seemed unfocused, looking through her rather than at her. She asked if he was the one who had been flashing the lights, if he needed help. He didn't respond immediately, just continued staring with that unsettling, vacant expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and what he said made Sarah's blood run cold. He told her she needed to leave immediately, that she wasn't safe here, that they had been waiting for someone like her to stop by. His voice was urgent but strangely emotionless, like he was reading from a script. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for months afterward. From somewhere in the back of the store came a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was accompanied by a low, guttural sound that didn't seem quite human. The clerk's eyes widened with what looked like genuine terror, and he grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. That's when everything went completely wrong. He whispered frantically that she needed to run, that she needed to get out now before they realized she was there. The scraping sound was getting closer, accompanied by what sounded like multiple footsteps moving in an unnatural, shuffling rhythm. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the exit. The clerk's terrified expression burned into her memory. The automatic doors seemed to take forever to open, and she could hear the sounds from the back of the store getting louder, more aggressive. Whatever was making those noises was definitely heading toward the front of the store. Sarah sprinted to her car, fumbling with her keys as panic overtook her fine motor skills. As she finally got her car started and threw it into drive, she glanced back at the store one last time. The clerk was no longer behind the counter. In fact, the entire store appeared to be empty, the lights still blazing but no sign of human life anywhere. But what made her floor the accelerator and never look back was what she saw moving past the windows. Dark shapes, too tall and moving in ways that human bodies simply shouldn't move. Sarah drove the remaining 100 miles to her parents' house without stopping, running on pure adrenaline and whatever gas she'd managed to pump. She never reported the incident, convinced that no one would believe her story. But 3 weeks later, she saw a news report that made her realize she wasn't crazy. The gas station had been found abandoned, with signs of what police described as a violent struggle inside. The clerk was never found, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Our second story comes from Marcus, a long-haul trucker who'd been driving interstate routes for over 2 decades. He thought he'd seen every type of weird situation the road could throw at him. Drunk drivers, severe weather, mechanical failures, and even the occasional robbery attempt. But nothing in his 20 years of experience prepared him for what happened at a truck stop outside of Bakersfield, California. It was a Wednesday night in October, and Marcus was making his regular run from Phoenix to Sacramento. He was running ahead of schedule, which was rare, and decided to stop at a 24-hour truck stop he'd used dozens of times before. The place was usually busy even late at night, with truckers grabbing food, fuel, and rest before continuing their routes. But when Marcus pulled into the lot at around 2 a.m., something was immediately off. The parking area that was normally packed with big rigs was almost completely empty. Only two other trucks were parked in the far corner, and neither showed any signs of their drivers being awake. The main building was lit up as usual, but there were no customers visible through the windows. Marcus needed fuel and had been looking forward to grabbing his usual late-night coffee and sandwich combo. So he parked near the pumps and climbed down from his cab. The silence was the first thing that struck him. Truck stops are never quiet. There's always the sound of idling engines, air brakes, drivers talking, and the general hum of activity. But this place felt like a ghost town. As he began fueling his truck, Marcus noticed that the two other rigs in the parking lot had their doors open as if their drivers had left in a hurry. One truck even had its engine still running, which no experienced trucker would ever do during a fuel stop. The scene was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like something had gone seriously wrong. The fuel pump was taking its time, and Marcus found himself constantly checking over his shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, but every time he looked around, he saw nothing but empty pavement and shadows. He tried to shake off the paranoia, telling himself he was just tired and letting his imagination run wild. That's when he heard the screaming. It came from inside the main building, muffled but unmistakably human. A man's voice, shouting for help, then suddenly cutting off mid-scream. Marcus had heard plenty of fights and arguments at truck stops over the years, but this sounded different. This sounded like genuine terror. He finished fueling as quickly as possible and approached the building cautiously. Through the windows, he could see the convenience store area looked normal enough, with its rows of snacks and refrigerated drinks. But there was no clerk behind the counter, and the screaming had stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence. The automatic doors opened as he approached, and Marcus stepped inside. The smell hit him immediately, something metallic and sharp that made his nose burn. The fluorescent lights were flickering intermittently, casting shifting shadows that made everything look distorted and threatening. He called out, asking if anyone needed help, but got no response. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Marcus had been in enough dangerous situations to trust his instincts, and every alarm bell in his head was going off. But the thought that someone might genuinely need help kept him from leaving immediately. As he moved deeper into the store, Marcus noticed dark stains on the floor near the counter. They looked fresh, still wet, and had that unmistakable metallic smell he'd encountered during his time in the military years earlier. These weren't spilled drinks or motor oil. This was blood, and a lot of it. That's when he heard movement from the back office area. Not footsteps exactly, but a dragging sound like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and getting closer to where Marcus stood frozen in the center of the store. He backed toward the exit, but the automatic doors had stopped working. They remained firmly closed no matter how he waved his hands in front of the sensors or pushed against them manually. The dragging sound was getting louder, and now he could hear breathing, heavy and labored, coming from the darkened hallway that led to the employee areas. Marcus was a big man, over 6 feet tall and strong from years of physical labor, but he'd never felt as helpless as he did in that moment. He was trapped in a brightly lit box with something dangerous approaching from the shadows, and his only escape route had been cut off. The breathing was getting closer, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversation, though he couldn't make out any actual words. It was like hearing people talk underwater, distorted and unsettling. Marcus grabbed a tire iron from a display rack, the only thing in the store that could serve as a weapon. That's when the lights went out completely. The store plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of black that makes you question whether your eyes are even open. Marcus couldn't see his hand in front of his face, but he could still hear the sounds getting closer. The breathing was now coming from multiple directions, as if several people were surrounding him in the darkness. He swung the tire iron blindly, connecting with something solid that let out an inhuman shriek. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, part animal, part machinery, part human scream. Whatever he'd hit stumbled backward, but Marcus could hear others moving around him, circling like predators. In desperation, he charged toward where he remembered the doors being, shoulder-checking his way through displays and knocking over merchandise. His shoulder connected with the glass doors, and they shattered outward, finally giving him an escape route. He stumbled through the broken glass and ran for his truck, not caring about the cuts on his hands and arms. As Marcus fumbled with his keys, he could see shapes moving inside the darkened store. They seemed wrong somehow, too tall in some places, too short in others, moving in ways that defied normal human anatomy. He got his engine started and peeled out of the parking lot, his headlights briefly illuminating the storefront as he fled. In that moment of illumination, he saw them clearly for the first time. 3 figures standing in the broken doorway watching him leave. They were definitely human-shaped, but something about their proportions was fundamentally wrong. Their arms were too long, their heads tilted at impossible angles, and their eyes reflected the headlight beams like an animal's would. Marcus drove straight through to Sacramento without stopping, arriving hours ahead of schedule and badly shaken. He reported the incident to the highway patrol, but when they investigated the next morning, they found the truck stop operating normally. The clerk on duty claimed nothing unusual had happened, and there was no sign of the blood Marcus had seen or the broken glass from his escape. But Marcus noticed something that the police missed. Those 2 trucks that had been parked in the corner when he arrived, they were still there, still with their doors open and engines running. And according to the highway patrol report, they'd been abandoned there for over a week. Our final story comes from David, who was working the night shift at a small gas station just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. It was his first job out of high school, and he'd been working there for about 6 months when this incident occurred. The job was usually pretty boring, especially during the overnight hours when traffic was light and most customers were just truckers or late-night travelers grabbing snacks and fuel. David had gotten comfortable with the routine: restock the shelves, clean the coffee machines, handle the occasional customer, and count down the hours until his replacement arrived at 6 in the morning. He'd never had any serious problems during his shifts, and the worst thing he'd dealt with was the occasional drunk customer or someone trying to buy alcohol without proper ID. But on this particular night in November, everything changed. It started around 3 a.m., during what David called the dead zone. That period between midnight and dawn when barely anyone stopped by, and he could usually catch up on homework or scroll through his phone between customers. He was restocking the candy display when he heard a car pull up to the pumps outside. Looking through the window, David saw an old sedan, probably from the 80s, with primer spots and mismatched body panels. The kind of car that suggested its owner was either really into restoration projects or barely scraping by financially. A man got out and began pumping gas, but something about his movements seemed off. Too slow, too deliberate, like he was moving underwater. The man finished pumping and walked toward the store. But he stopped just outside the range of the security cameras and stood there motionless for several minutes. David could see him through the window, just standing in the shadows beyond the canopy lights, not moving at all. It was like he was waiting for something or working up the courage to come inside. Finally, the automatic doors opened and the man entered. He was probably in his 50s, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and his eyes had a wild, unfocused quality that immediately put David on edge. The man didn't acknowledge David's greeting, instead wandering the aisles like he was looking for something specific but couldn't remember what. David kept an eye on him while pretending to work, following standard protocol for potentially problematic customers. The man picked up random items, examined them closely, then put them back in the wrong places. He spent an unusually long time in the automotive section, handling tools and car accessories with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for someone just browsing. After about 20 minutes, the man approached the counter with a single item: a pack of zip ties. Not unusual in itself, but combined with his strange behavior and appearance, it made David nervous. He rang up the purchase quickly, hoping the man would leave without incident. But instead of paying and leaving, the man leaned across the counter and asked David what time he got off work. The question was delivered in a casual tone, but there was something predatory about the way he asked it, like he was gathering information for a specific purpose. David lied, saying his replacement would be there soon, hoping to discourage whatever the man might be planning. The man paid for his zip ties and left. But instead of driving away, he parked his car around the side of the building where it wasn't visible from the main road. David could see him through the side window, just sitting in his car, occasionally looking toward the store. The behavior was so obviously threatening that David almost called the police right then, but he wasn't sure what he would report. Sitting in a parking lot wasn't illegal, even if it was creepy. An hour passed with the man still parked outside, and David was getting increasingly anxious. No other customers had stopped by, leaving him alone with whatever this guy was planning. He tried calling his manager, but got voicemail. His replacement wasn't due for another 2 hours, and David was starting to panic about what might happen before then. That's when the power went out. The entire building plunged into darkness, including the exterior lights and gas pump illumination. David's first thought was that it might be a planned outage or equipment failure. But the timing seemed too convenient given the suspicious customer still lurking outside. He fumbled for the emergency flashlight kept behind the counter. But before he could find it, he heard the automatic doors open. Someone had entered the store in the darkness, and David was pretty sure he knew who it was. He crouched behind the counter, trying to stay quiet while feeling around for either the flashlight or his cell phone. Heavy footsteps moved through the store, not the casual browsing pattern from earlier, but purposeful and direct. The person knew exactly where they were going, despite the complete darkness. David could hear items being knocked off shelves and the sound of someone moving with confidence through the aisles. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the counter where David was hiding. He could hear breathing, slow and steady, and the subtle sound of something metallic being handled. David was pretty sure he knew what that metallic sound was, and the thought of those zip ties made his heart race even faster. In desperation, David felt around behind the counter until his hand found the silent alarm button that connected directly to the local police station. He pressed it multiple times, hoping the system still worked despite the power outage. The store had a backup battery system for security equipment, but he wasn't sure if it included the alarm. The person on the other side of the counter seemed to sense David's movement. The breathing stopped, and David could feel someone leaning over the counter trying to locate him in the darkness. A hand brushed against his shoulder, and David lost all pretense of hiding quietly. He bolted from behind the counter, knocking over displays and merchandise as he ran toward where he remembered the emergency exit being located. The store layout was confusing enough in good lighting, but in complete darkness it became a maze of obstacles and dead ends. Behind him, David could hear his pursuer giving chase, moving with surprising speed through the cluttered space. The emergency exit was secured with an alarm, but David didn't care about setting it off at this point. He slammed into the door with his full body weight, and it burst open into the cold night air. David ran toward the main road, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle or at least get away from the isolated gas station. As he reached the edge of the parking lot, he could see police cars approaching with their lights flashing, responding to the silent alarm he'd triggered. When the officers swept the building, they found it empty except for evidence that someone had indeed been inside during the power outage. The electrical system had been deliberately sabotaged, with wires cut in a way that suggested someone familiar with basic electrical work. More disturbing, they found the pack of zip ties the man had purchased, along with other items that suggested he'd been planning to restrain someone. The old sedan was gone, and despite an extensive search of the area, the man was never found. David quit his job the next week and never worked alone at night again. The gas station installed additional security measures and changed their policy to require 2 employees during overnight shifts. But the thing that still bothers David even years later is something the police never found an explanation for. When they reviewed the security footage from before the power was cut, they discovered something unsettling. The timestamp showed the man had been in the store for over 3 hours before David even noticed him. somehow avoiding detection while David went about his normal routine. The cameras had captured him moving through the store like he knew the layout perfectly, accessing areas that customers weren't supposed to enter, and at one point, standing directly behind David while he worked, close enough to touch him. David had been alone with a dangerous predator for hours without realizing it, and the thought of how close he'd come to becoming a victim still gives him nightmares. These three stories share common elements that make gas stations particularly vulnerable to dangerous encounters. They're isolated, often understaffed, and create situations where potential victims are alone and distracted. The bright lights that should provide safety instead create a beacon that attracts both legitimate customers and those with darker intentions. If you find yourself at a gas station late at night, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't hesitate to leave immediately if you sense danger. And always let someone know your travel plans when driving alone at night. The few dollars you might save by stopping at an isolated station isn't worth risking your safety. Remember, the people in these stories survived because they recognized the danger and acted quickly. Sarah trusted her instincts and fled when the situation escalated. Marcus fought his way out when trapped. David used the security systems available to him and didn't hesitate to run when necessary. Stay safe out there, and remember that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary dangers. If you have your own gas station horror story, share it in the comments below. But remember that not every late-night stop has to end in terror. Most of the time, you'll fill up your tank, grab your snacks, and continue on your way without incident. But sometimes, just sometimes, you might find yourself face to face with something that reminds you that there are still dark corners in our modern world where very real monsters choose to hide.